Best offense in the country? Well, they certainly have the talent and personnel to do it in 2022. We got Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts 247 Sports right here at the Voice of College Football to break down Ohio State heading towards spring practice. Hey, Pat, how's it going today?
It's good. Hopefully it starts to feel like spring here in Columbus. I think it's supposed to start warming up this week. So, it'd be nice to kind of get out of winter here in central Ohio.
Yeah, we got teased with about here in Connecticut with about 3 days of 55 to 60 last week, and then back down into the deep plunge of the mid 20s. So, yeah, I'm right
Right.
there with you. We shall see. March is always a wild card.
For
All
sure.
right. What should not be a wild card is Ohio State's offense this year, despite losing two of the best wide receivers in the country and a future NFL tight end and offensive lineman. Let's start with CJ Stroud. His growth was evident. Not that he played poorly the first couple of weeks. I would like to set a few people straight on that, but that's an argument that's been long since passed. But certainly the numbers he put up and the show in the Rose Bowl, the numbers for the entire season and the show in the Rose Bowl, just eye-popping. Just your thoughts about CJ Stroud, and of course the backup situation has been altered here in the last few months as well.
CJ Stroud should come into this season as a Heisman frontrunner. And I don't want to put him at the front of it. Obviously, you have Bryce Young from Alabama who won it last year coming back. So he should be the front runner. But CJ Stroud was a finalist last year. He didn't finish as high as he wanted. We've talked about that. It was kind of his motivation going into the Rose Bowl. But certainly in that mix. And, you play for Ohio State. Ryan Day said it. You're the quarterback. You should be, in the conversation for the Heisman at the very least. So you've got a second-year quarterback who last year threw for 4,435 yards and 44 touchdowns and just 6 interceptions. And now he's in his second year in the program. As you mentioned, he will lose some pieces, and we'll get to kind of the weapons around him. But CJ Stroud set up for a lot of success. It's kind of like that second year under Justin Fields coming in before, season was canceled and then rescheduled. I mean, the expectations for Fields were very high, and that'll be the case again for Stroud. I imagine, you'll see him do some things or hear about things in the spring that he's doing, and obviously the spring game, and that'll set the bar pretty high. And I think he's ready to meet that. I think he's not shying away from the expectations of being the Ohio State quarterback, and those expectations are very high given what he did as a redshirt freshman. You mentioned the backup competition. That's going to be interesting. Jack Miller's gone. Quinn Ewers is gone. Ohio State's still pretty loaded in that quarterback room. 5-star Kyle McCord was a freshman last year. Obviously, Buckeye fans got to see him play some. I think he played in 5 games, threw 416 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 picks. Was what you expected out of a guy playing his first real football in limited action. And then behind him, you have Devin Brown, a high 4-star kid who was originally committed to USC, flipped to Ohio State, is already on campus, enrolled early. And we talked to him. We mentioned this last time I was on the show. We talked to him on National Signing Day. Really impressed with kind of his demeanor, his approach to this quarterback competition. I think Ohio State has a lot of talent. Obviously, CJ Stroud, assuming health, knock on wood, is going to be the guy. But that battle to be his backup, which doesn't necessarily mean you're the heir apparent, but it certainly puts you in that conversation going into what will likely be the start of the next year after CJ Stroud, we assume, if he has a good season, leaves for the NFL. So these guys want to set themselves up for success, show the coaches what they can do. I think that probably one of the most interesting offensive battles. There's just so much talent coming back. Watching what happens at that backup quarterback spot and how these guys do is something I'm going to keep my eye on between Kyle McCord and Devin Brown.
What I alluded to at the top of the conversation about the quarterback position is any concerns or minute criticisms that were reasonable against CJ Stroud, I think completely were cleared up by the end of the year. Anything regarding indecisiveness, confidence, anything that you would expect out of a guy taking his first snaps against the likes of Minnesota and Oregon, having never thrown a pass in college football. So completely cleaned up as a passer and one of the very best in the nation, arguably the top 2. I don't think there's any question, really. Okay. One small criticism away from the throwing game would be there are times in which it appears as though, wow, The sea is parted. It's opened up right in front of him. It's 3rd and 4. Take that first down. Just run. We know that you're an athlete to a certain extent, no question. You can run. Take the first down. Do you think we may see him coached to run the ball when those obvious passing lanes open up and he can run it downfield to pick up a first down?
I don't know if he'll be coached to do any more than he did last year. I think you saw at the end of the year in big games, CJ Stroud was willing to do that on a minimal level at certain times. There was the play against Michigan. That play ended up getting called back for a holding call where he actually scored a touchdown. I forget how long the run was. And then he had a big, I think it was a 3rd down play, picked up 10 yards in the Rose Bowl against Utah. So in games when they needed him to be big on the ground, he picked and chose his points to do it. But I don't think he's a running quarterback. He's made that pretty clear. I don't think Ryan Day necessarily wants a running quarterback. I think Ohio State fans are so used to what they had under Urban Meyer, where guys were running a lot, that they expect to see that. And certainly Ryan Day wants these guys to be athletic and be able to move around. But if you look at the guys they've recruited, CJ Stroud, not a big runner. Jack Miller was much more of a guy who could move around behind the line of scrimmage by time. Kyle McCord can move around fine. Devin Brown looks to be the same type of guy. So they're not going to get guys that are going to run a lot. They want distributors to all these weapons. And I think that's where CJ Stroud showed that he excels. Now, in the big moment, I think he can still make that play on the ground, and I think he did. It just doesn't come as often as maybe Buckeye fans want to see, given what they've seen in the past.
We got Pat Murphy on the line to break down the Buckeyes as we head toward spring practice in a few weeks. And we are looking at each and every offensive position. The Buckeyes should be prolific on that side of the ball once again in 2022. At running back, TreVeyon Henderson certainly lived up to the hype. Game 3 was his big breakout in his record-setting performance against Tulsa. I think some people then expected that to be a weekly scenario and put a little bit too much pressure and expectation on him. They certainly limited his carries. Master Teague and Mayan Williams were still part of the running carries distribution, but a tremendous season by TreVeyon Henderson, who certainly proved to be the number 1 running back coming out of high school.
Yeah, he was what everyone expected and then some. I mean, I guess you can criticize the fact that he didn't have 277 yards and 3 touchdowns every game, but you're not going against Tulsa every week. He had, 3 100-plus yard rushing games, came close in another couple, went well over 1,000 yards for an Ohio State freshman, broke Ohio State freshman rushing records, finished with 15 touchdowns on the season. Well, 19 touchdowns total if you count his receiving touchdowns as well. So that is what I think that was the best case scenario for TreVeyon Henderson, especially given he didn't start the first few games of the season, first 2 games, I think. He really established himself. And as you mentioned, Master Teague was involved. Mayan Williams was involved. Marcus Crowley, before he got hurt, was involved. So, Ohio State wasn't ready to fully just give the entire workload to a true freshman, even throughout the season. This year will certainly be interesting because Mayan Williams is back. Master Teague's gone off to the NFL. Mayan Williams is back. Marcus Crowley, once he gets healthy, this is his second major injury, so we'll see how that situation plays out. And then you've got Evan Pryor, who is a guy who played in 4 games, ended up redshirting last year, had just over 90 yards and a touchdown in limited carries. But if TreVeyon Henderson isn't in Ohio State's 2021 class, Evan Pryor is probably a guy that everyone's excited to see. He was still highly ranked, showed some good things in limited carries last year. So that's a guy I think can work his way up. I still think Mayan Williams is probably the number 2, but maybe Evan Pryor works into a number 3 spot, 2B type of situation, because I think he's really talented. TreVeyon Henderson's going to get the bulk of the carries, and I think you'll see him get even more than he did a year ago, unless Ohio State just starts blowing teams out week after week after week like we saw a few years ago. But you're going to see some of these other guys mixed in. Tony Alford has shown he likes to do that, and it keeps guys like TreVeyon Henderson, who was banged up some during the year, missed some second halves of games where Ohio State didn't need to put him back in because he was hurt, had to come out of a number of games, and eventually went back in. But they don't want to have him suffer any serious injuries, so they'll use the other talent on their roster, and they certainly have that in Mayan Williams, Evan Pryor.
Yeah, it's amazing what happens to people's perceptions when you put that number one next to somebody's name,
Right.
meaning number one running back in the country, Travion Henderson. Had he not been recruited and signed, Evan Pryor was what, like the third or fourth ranked running back in the
Yeah,
country?
he was up
All,
there.
yes, all the attention would have been on him as the future of the running back room on his shoulders. So let's not discard him and his Ohio State future, certainly. Pat Murphy's on the line breaking down the Buckeyes headed toward spring practice, going position by position on the offensive side of the ball. My goodness, the wide receivers, they lose two of the best in the country, and they are still loaded beyond belief. I don't know if these guys can meet expectations, exceed expectations. I don't know what they can possibly be, that they just don't haul down everything in sight. But the room is loaded. I guess it's up to Ryan Day and staff to figure out who should go where in regards to the X and the Y in the slot and how that plays out.
Absolutely. I mean, it's crazy that you lose a guy like Garrett Wilson, a guy like Chris Olave, who had done so much in their careers to the NFL, and Jackson Smith and Jigba still is arguably the best receiver of that group. Statistically, he had the most yards last year, the most receptions, didn't have the most touchdowns, only 9 touchdowns. But to have a guy like that coming back is huge for Ohio State. I mean, he's NFL ready probably right now with the year he put together. And then, as you mentioned, the other guys behind them, Marvin Harrison Jr., who really showed up in the Rose Bowl with his performance, 3 touchdowns in that game. The first real times Ohio State got to see him in game action. He did play a little bit throughout the season, but that was the first time without Chris Olave, without Garrett Wilson, that he got a chance to shine. Like Emeka Egbuka, Buckeye fans saw him with the ball in his hands on special teams quite a bit. Still only had 9 catches on the year, 191 yards. I think that number will increase this year. But depending on how Ohio State's lines up, if Jackson Smith and Jigba remains as the slot receiver, which is what he was more often than not this year, that's where Emeka Egbuka generally lined up as well. So either they're going to move guys around a bit more to get Emeka Egbuka on the field, or maybe he's a guy that still takes another year or so. Remember, he was the number one receiver recruit in the country last year. Maybe he takes another year to really pop for Ohio State. But Brian Hartline's done a great job of figuring out how to get these guys on the field, how to maximize the talent they have in the receiver room. And, that's only the top 3 guys that we're talking about there. Julian Fleming, who was the number one receiver recruit in the country 2 years ago, will be entering his 3rd year. He's hoping to be healthy after dealing with shoulder injuries. Hasn't quite lived up to the hype yet. That could be a guy who emerges as another outside threat. They just have a number of guys that could step in. We could go down the list, but we would be here all day talking Ohio State wide receivers. Just rest assured, CJ Stroud has plenty of weapons to throw the ball to.
Absolutely. Breaking down the Buckeyes with Pat Murphy, 247 Sports on Bucknuts. Please join him and the rest of the staff there on the deep dive on Ohio State football and basketball. All right, Jeremy Ruckert's off to the NFL. The tight end position, let's see, got him 26 receptions for 3 touchdowns. It's never going to be prolific, especially with all those targets going to the wide receivers. But is this Cade Stover's to lose? Who else is in the mix?
Well, it's certainly going to be interesting. We saw Cade Stover move back to the defensive side of the ball where he started his Ohio State career for the Michigan game and the Rose Bowl, just because Ohio State needed some help at linebacker. Where Cade Stover ends up is going to be determined this offseason. If I had to guess right after the Rose Bowl, when we talked to Cade Stover, I'd say he wants to play on the defensive side of the ball. Kevin Wilson made it sound like they were going to do what's best for Cade Stover and not so much what's best for the tight end room. As you mentioned, that's a group that doesn't need to catch a lot of balls. They do need to block, and that's going to be important. He's a guy who can do that. So if he ends up on offense at tight end, he's your number one guy for sure. If he's back on the defensive side, then you're going to go with some young guys there. And fortunately, they did get Mitch Rossi back. He's back for a 6th year, I believe. Former walk-on who he's more of a H-back, sometimes lines up as a fullback, but can certainly do the blocking aspects they ask of a tight end. Not going to catch a ton of passes. Then behind him, G. Scott Jr., former top-ranked wide receiver who will now be in his 2nd full year as a tight end. You've got Joe Royer, who they really liked as he'll be a sophomore this upcoming year. He's a guy that Kevin Wilson was very high on. Sam Hart didn't play last year. He redshirted. So it'll be very interesting to see what they do with this tight end group. As you mentioned, The receivers are going to catch most of the passes. You need the guys that are going to be able to block and make those plays like Luke Farrell 2 years ago, like Jeremy Ruckert the last couple of years did when called upon. You know, Ruckert caught some really big passes for Ohio State. You go back to the college football playoff game against Clemson. You go to a Penn State game 2 years ago where he caught, I think, 2 touchdowns in that game. So the Titans need to be able to not only block but make plays when called upon. When you have a young group like this group may be, maybe you focus even less on getting them the ball. But a guy like G. Scott Jr. could be big in the passing game for Ohio State, relatively to what we've seen from tight ends, given the talent he has when he was a wide receiver.
I believe Rutgers had that one-handed catch against Alabama down the seam to set up the first touchdown as well. Scott caught 5, Rossi 4, and Royer 1 in limited duty for the Buckeyes at tight end last season. All right, Pat, they're going to score a ton of points, rack up yardage, and it's going to come from the running back position with Henderson leading the way and all the wideouts that we discussed, Stroud orchestrating the whole thing. But against the great defenses, the really good defenses in the Big Ten, Michigan, Penn State, Iowa's on the schedule, Notre Dame, of course, in week 1, the offensive line is going to have to be stellar for this team to reach championship level performance. There, Munford's gone, Nicholas Petit, free air. How many questions are there along the offensive line, and how does it stack up at this point?
Certainly filling those 2 spots is going to be important for Ohio State. You do have Dwan Jones and Paris Johnson, who should be your starting tackles. Paris Johnson, as a sophomore last year, moved in and played guard just to get on the field. But he talked to us at the end of the season about how excited he was just to get back to play tackle. Whether they keep Dwan Jones at right tackle and put Paris Johnson at left tackle or switch them, we'll see. I'm sure that'll be worked out. But you've got 2 very good tackles there, even though Paris Johnson hasn't played a ton at that position at the collegiate level. He was, I think, the top offensive tackle or one of them when he came out of high school out of Cincinnati. So you have those 2 spots figured out. It's just about what side guys will play on. The guard spots, Matthew Jones, who's been kind of a rotational guy at the interior of the offensive line for the last 2 years, looks in line to finally become a starter. You've got Harry Miller coming back, who could play center or could play guard. You've got Donovan Jackson, the second-year player who was really highly recruited. He's a guy I think could step in and start at one of the guard positions as well. Luke Whippler, returning for Ohio State, stepped in last year as a freshman when Harry Miller was unavailable and played great at the center position. Not a place you generally see a young guy do well for a program like Ohio State, but he was certainly on top of things and is going to be the starting center again for the Buckeyes. So you've got an idea of what the offensive line will look like. Certainly there's some things to work out, and there's definitely depth pieces that can step in. But I think this offensive line is going to be as good, if not better, than last year. I think, and we've talked about this, using 4 tackles sometimes hurt the Buckeyes in run games, and it got your best guys on the field. But now I think you'll have guys in the right positions and be able to do everything that the offensive line can. And there's certainly plenty of talent there.
For the top 5 recruited players and signed players in the 2022 class on defense, probably because of that, and then more so, there's just so many veterans that have proven themselves and such stacks of talent at each unit. You got to figure this 2022 class is not even needed on the offensive side, and it's going to be a great situation where all those guys can just take the year to develop, get reps in practice, and get ready for 23 to make a push.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, on the offensive line, that's a huge thing. I mean, you need time to develop. You need time to be ready to go. Coming from high school, it's not one of those positions that you generally just step right into. So having that depth and guys getting reps, especially like we said earlier, if Ohio State can win some of the games the way they're expected to, get guys in there, that'll be huge for the Buckeyes going forward, because it will be a more or less veteran offensive line this year. And obviously guys will need to step into those spots next season.
And I make that statement basically for the entire offense. And that's unheard of in college football, as I review all these teams where you can say everybody in the current recruiting class, and we're talking about a top 4-1 in the nation, you can just, from the offensive standpoint, just get them reps, get them ready, and they can pretty much not take the year off, but in terms of Saturdays, just watch and get ready for 2023. And that's a tremendous luxury to be in.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you think about the guys, the main names we just talked about. CJ Stroud probably gone after this year. Jackson Smith and Jigba probably gone after this year. Travion Henderson will be back. Marvin Harrison will be back. Some of the younger guys, the offensive line, as I just mentioned, a lot of those guys gone. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the young guys develop. Like I said earlier about the quarterback position, not only in the spring when these two guys, Devin Brown and Kyle McCord, are battling, but who gets reps during the season when Ohio State's up big? How important is that? Obviously, Kyle McCord has some under his belt. You will probably want to get Devin Brown some, but Kyle McCord still needs to develop. Rotating the receivers, things like that. I think there's a lot of interesting things on the offense, not only for this season, and obviously the goal is to win this season, but with an eye towards that 2023 when you're going to be replacing a lot of guys.
Pat Murphy, Bucknuts 247 Sports. Check out his work right there, not only on football, but as the Buckeyes basketball team heads toward the Big Ten tournament and March Madness. Pat, we appreciate you stopping by as always. We'll have to reel you back to break down the defense.
Yeah, the defense will be fun. We'll have to do that one soon.